Um, so welcome everybody to our 8th Tune In Tuesday of the year. My name is Michaela Moss. I'm the Executive Director for the Friends of the Missouri Breaks Monument. We're a small nonprofit based out of Helena, Montana, dedicated to the protection and preservation of the monument through stewardship, education, and advocacy. 2021 has been a really big year for both us and the monument, as we have both turned 20 years old. So in celebration of our 20th anniversary, the Friends have been hosting these online education events to highlight some of the amazing features of the monument and of its surrounding areas and some of the work that's been going on in there. So far, been really lucky with some really excellent speakers who have talked to us on a range of subjects, from land management to ecology to wildlife. And tonight is no different, as we're lucky enough to be joined by Will Glenny. He is a PhD student at Montana State University in the Department of Ecology, and his work is focusing on plant and pollinator communities. So I hope you guys are all as excited to hear his presentation as I am. And before I turn it over to him, I just have a couple little housekeeping things I need to go over for the presentation. So I would ask that everybody keeps themselves muted for the presentation, just to avoid any feedback issues. So if you click on that little microphone in the bottom left hand of your screen, you should get a little red flash through your microphone, and that means you're muted. Otherwise, feel free to turn your videos on. We like to talk to faces, but feel free to leave them off as well, if you're all enjoying dinner maybe. So other than that, we will have time for questions at the end. So save your questions, write them down. We'll make sure to have time to answer those. You can also type them into the chat box at any point, and we'll be reading through those and make sure they get answered at the end. So with that, I will end my portion of talking and hand things over to Will. Thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Michaela. Let me go ahead and share my screen here so you guys can all see my presentation. Cool. So with that, get started. Thanks, Michaela, for inviting me to give a talk tonight, and thank you guys for tuning in at this dinner hour. This sort of venue gives me a unique opportunity to present my research to sort of a different crowd than what I'm used to in the academic sphere, so it's really fun for me to be able to do this. So the title of my talk is Pollinator Conservation on Public Lands. This is work that I've thought about for a while with my committee members at Montana State, Dr. Justin Runyon and Dr. Laura Burkle. Just as another quick brief introduction about who I am, I'm a PhD student at Montana State University in the Department of Ecology. And I'm advised by Dr. Laura Burkle, and in our lab, we mostly focus on pollinators, where in the state they exist, who they are, and who they interact with. And we do this in a number of different ecosystems, ranging from post-disturbance ecosystems, urban ecosystems. And so it's a really good way to understand where the bees exist in Montana. So while I still have your guys' attention, I like to acknowledge who makes this work possible. As I mentioned, Dr. Laura Burkle, really important for this work, and also Dr. Justin Runyon, who's a research entomologist at the Rocky Mountain Research Station with the Forest Service here in Bozeman, Montana. So on top of that, I also work with biologists on the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest and in far southwest Montana, and then also the Helena, Lewis, and Clark National Forest, which you guys might be more familiar with in the west central part of the state. So briefly, before we really get into the meat of the conversation, I like to give a little bit of an outline where the talk is headed, and I like to view it sort of in two different parts. The first one is going to be mostly a general conversation about the status of pollinator conservation on federal and public lands throughout the United States. And then the second part of the talk is more specific to the research that I do at Montana State University, which is designing seed mixes for pollinator habitat revegetation in these federal and public lands. And so just to begin, I'd like to point out that pollinators are critical for the environment and the economy. So nearly 1/3 of crops rely on pollinators, which is valued roughly at $180 billion annually globally. And so just as sort of like a thought experiment, here on the right side of the screen, in the top panel is a situation where you have your normal array of fruits and nuts and vegetables to demonstrate all of the selection of food that we have, which are also produced by bees. But in the bottom panel is what would happen if we were to remove bees, and you can see that our diets become much less fruitful and colorful and ultimately less healthy. So on top of the benefits of pollinators for the environment and the economy, they also play an important role in human public health. And then on top of just their agricultural benefits, 60 to 90% of all plants in general on the planet rely on animal pollination for reproduction. And also more simply, and the reason why I really like pollinators is because they're largely responsible for these aesthetic value of the landscapes that we all come to know and love. So this is just an example from Southern California and Nevada in Death Valley National Park, which is what's come to be known as a super bloom, which in particularly wet years in this area, flowers come out all at once, and it creates this really, really colorful landscape. But the portion of the story that's important to acknowledge is that pollinators are also then required to transport pollen in between these different flowers in order for the flowers to produce seed and then ultimately reproduce. And so pollinators play a critical role in maintaining the aesthetic value of some of these landscapes that we love to recreate in. However, wild bee abundance across most of the United States is in decline. So this is a map of the United States, and the yellow colors represent areas where pollinators are in decline. And the blue area represents areas of the United States where pollinators abundance is high. And the pattern here is not too difficult to connect the dots, but I'll point out a couple landmarks and see if you guys can see what I'm getting at. So here's the Central Valley of California. This is where there's obviously intensive agriculture. And then through here in the upper Midwest of the United States is where a lot of tall grass prairie has been converted into largely soybean and cornfields. And then throughout this Great Lakes region here, it's intensive urbanization, and down through the Mississippi River Valley, where there's a lot of agriculture, are all areas where we've seen the largest reduction in wild bee abundance. So bees are not really responding too well to urbanization and intensive land use change. But the good part of this story is that there's still large untracked lands out here in the Western United States, which still have high bee abundance, potentially indicating that these are valuable sources for pollinator conservation throughout the United States. And so with that in mind, the federal government in 2015 created this national strategy to promote the health of honeybees and other pollinators. And so this brought together pollinator biologists from a number of different agencies around the government, like the Forest Service, the Geologic Survey, the Bureau of Land Management, some other smaller institutions like the Department of Transportation, to develop a pollinator conservation strategy. And importantly, this identified a research action plan, a public outreach plan, and identified public-private partnerships to be able to create a pollinator management plan that operated at such a large scale, like the entire United States. And so this is really meant to improve pollinator habitat across huge spatial scales. And then almost more importantly is the fact that this report pointed out that a large reason for pollinator decline is just simply exposure to pesticides. And so limiting that stressor on pollinators might be particularly important as well for their conservation. And so it's pretty critical that federal agencies manage pollinator habitat because federal land management agencies manage a ton of area across the United States. So here's another map of the United States where the different colors represent the areas that are managed by one of the 4 largest land management agencies in the United States. Um, Blue being the Fish and Wildlife Service, pink being the Bureau of Land Management, red being the National Park Service, and green being the Forest Service. And what's somewhat encouraging about this is that a lot of the land that these agencies manage overlap with some of those areas where wild bee abundance is the highest. So it means that federal agencies have a large role in conserving pollinator populations into the future. And so I like to use 2 specific examples from some of these areas that are managed by federal agencies. So the first one being Pinnacles National Park. So this is one of the smaller national parks in the United States in Central California, where over the past decade or so, biologists have been able to identify about 450 different bee species that exist within the national park boundaries. And this represents some of the highest species density of bees in the United States. It's topped, however, by Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument in central Utah. And so over the past decade or so there, biologists have been able to identify 660 different bee species that exist within the monument boundaries. So these 2 areas alone represent a huge amount of bee diversity and require federal agencies to manage this critical pollinator habitat. So through these efforts, we've been able to document bees on public lands. Montana itself has about 400 species of wild bees. So to put that into perspective, Pinnacles National Park has more bee species than the entire state of Montana. The Burkle Lab alone has documented about 281 different species in Western Montana alone. So a lot of the regions that we work in are in the Flathead, the area around Helena, and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And then to put that into perspective for the entire country, there's about 4,000 species of bees that have been documented across the entire United States. And then another main objective for us is to be able to identify these species using the help of taxonomists, but also to be able to store them in such a way to where these specimens will exist forever. So that creates some really important museum information to where people can view these specimens into the future, and we can observe what might happen to these specimens, create these long-term data sets to be able to appropriately document bee decline or bee increase. And so through a lot of this work, scientists have been able to realize that there are plenty of bee species that are in decline. Most notably, there's good data on bumblebees throughout much of the United States to be able to list them as some species of conservation concern. So this started in 2016 with the federal listing of the rusty-patched bumblebee right up here. The rusty-patched bumblebee then became the first bee species to be federally recognized and protected under the Endangered Species Act. And the core of its range was in that Great Lakes region right around Wisconsin and Minnesota. But since then, we've been able to realize that there are multiple other species, bumblebee species, that are in rapid decline throughout the entire United States. And actually just recently, like a month ago, the Franklin's bumblebee out here was federally recognized under the Endangered Species Act. And it exists in this super restricted range on the border between Oregon and California. So we're starting to accumulate enough data to make some good management decisions and protections for some of these species across the United States. Near and dear to our hearts is the Western bumblebee, which is located here in Montana. It's on the verge of a species status assessment, mostly because its range has declined so rapidly in the past couple of decades. It used to be widely distributed from Alaska all the way to the border of Mexico, and from the coast, the western coast, all the way out to the Colorado Plateau. But since then, a combination of habitat decline, pathogens, and pesticide exposure has really restricted the core of the species range to high elevation wet areas. So that leaves it mostly in the mountainous regions of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, which means that these areas might actually be some core habitat that's left for this species and important for the conservation of this species. And so really what I think this boils down to is the fact that we use public lands for so many different services, including logging, grazing. We even store honeybee colonies on public lands to allow them to produce wildflower honey. So we require services from public lands, but they sometimes might be at odds with pollinator conservation. So you can imagine disturbances like prescribed burning or logging or cattle grazing might influence resource availability for pollinators, or the introduction of invasive species might outcompete some floral resources for pollinators. So all of these multiple uses of public lands are important to consider when we make conservation priorities for pollinators. And so that's sort of what I like to talk about for the first part of the talk, which is just pollinator conservation on public lands at a national scale. I'll sort of switch gears here into the second part of the talk to talk more about what I do as a graduate student at Montana State University, which is designing seed mixes for pollinator habitat revegetation on wildlands. So this is work that's funded through the United States Forest Service, specifically out of the Helena, Lewis, and Clark National Forest. And again, my committee members, Justin Runyon and Laura Burkle, were involved in this work, along with some biologists, Justina Dumont and Ted Snyder, who are on the forest as well. So seed mixes are an important strategy to revegetate landscapes following disturbances, in particular wildfires. So wildfires might be so important to revegetate these landscapes because what they do is they remove a lot of the vegetation, which is meant to hold and stabilize the soil. But if a wildfire comes through and removes that vegetation, it leaves a lot of that soil prone to erosion following rains and snowmelt, which then gets washed into creeks and streams and might degrade water quality for a lot of these rural towns, which rely on these headwater streams, which are prone to water quality issues. And so by dispersing these seed mixes into these post-disturbance habitats, it's a way in which we can hopefully reduce erosion by establishing some vegetation on these slopes. In addition, seed mixes can also be used to provide forage for grazers and also renaturalize decommissioned roads in order to restore vegetation in these areas. So while seed mixes are meant to restore vegetation, they're not necessarily designed to restore the vegetation that's important for pollinators. So usually these seed mixes prioritize plants that are cheap to produce. And that means that it usually prioritizes Eurasian grasses, native grasses, and shrub species. And so it doesn't necessarily include flowering plants, and it certainly doesn't include flowering plants that are preferred by pollinators. And so one of the goals that I have for my dissertation work is to be able to understand what makes a good seed mix for pollinators in these wildland ecosystems, and also to design a seed mix that can be applied throughout public lands in order to meet the habitat requirements of pollinators, but also to be able to revegetate some of these areas following disturbances. And so I'm kind of going to give away most of what I'm going to talk about right now, but just so that you guys have an outline of what I'm talking about in these following slides, I'll go over the key considerations for designing seed mixes for pollinators, particularly the methods that we use, but also the fact that we use native plants that are produced at large commercial scales that can tolerate a range of habitat conditions, bloom for the duration of the growing season, and also how we analyze these plant-pollinator interactions in order to identify the most important plants. So I'll just now go into more details of each of these bullet points in the coming slides. So the methods that we use to be able to identify some of these plants are observing pollinator visitation to these focal plant species commonly used in restoration projects in the Helena Lewis and Clark National Forest. So here in this left panel is an idea of the scale of the study that we are conducting, and where each one of these red dots represents a population of a plant species that we're interested in observing pollinator visitations to. And then here on the right is just sort of a representation of how we observe plant pollinator interactions to each one of these plant species in a number of different habitat types. So as I mentioned, we should be using native plants in these projects, and the native plants should be locally sourced and produced at large and commercial scales. So the reason why we like to use native plants is because they have these adaptations to local environments and pollinator communities. And this might just help plants respond better to things like disturbances or climate variability, something that they're adapted and evolved to. And so by using these plants, we're kind of thinking about restoring some of the natural systems in these ecosystems. On top of that, one of the challenges of using these native plants, though, is that we have to be able to provide them at the large scales, which are required by land managers. So you can think about how large a wildfire is. So in order to revegetate that system, a lot of times these seed mixes are actually dropped from helicopters or planes. And so we need to be able to produce these seeds at a huge bulk scale. And then on top of that, that can become pretty expensive. So these seeds need to be cheap and cost effective to source. Plants also need to be able to tolerate a wide range of habitat types. And so public lands contain a wide range of habitat types. And so we want to be able to use plants that are widely applicable across different habitat types to make sure that they can germinate and succeed in these habitat types. So the Helena Lewis and Clark National Forest is a really good example of this, because if anybody's familiar with it, then you'll know that there's a wide range of habitat types over a relatively short spatial area. So I like to point out here, the Little Belt Mountains are described mostly as a montane wetland or high elevation grassland system. But then just over here in the northern Big Belts, this is largely described as a dry ponderosa pine grassland. And then even further down here in the same range is a ponderosa pine forest. So we have a huge variability in habitat types. We want to think about the plants that can establish across these different habitat types to provide consistent floral resources for pollinators. So on top of that, seed mixes should contain plants that collectively bloom for the duration of the growing season. Pollinators themselves have different activity periods over the course of the growing season. So the pollinators that are active at the beginning of the growing season might be different from the pollinator species that are active at the end of the growing season. So we want to think about providing plants that can bloom for the entire duration of the growing season in order to provide consistent floral resources. So for instance, here is just a figure that I've made where along the x-axis is the time during the growing season. And then here along the y-axis is the abundance of a particular flower resource or pollinator species. What we can see is that there's different activity periods throughout the growing season, where there might be an early season, the middle of the season, and the late stages of the growing season. So our goal here is to create a seed mix that can provide floral resources consistently throughout the entirety of the growing season. We also need to understand that pollinators have species-specific foraging behaviors to be able to identify the plant species that might be most important for providing floral resources to the pollinator community. So this is a tool that we use in the Burkle lab pretty frequently. It's called the Plant Pollinator Interaction Network. And it's the best tool that we have to be able to visualize these really large communities and really complex communities in a relatively simple way. So to illustrate this, along the bottom here are different pollinator species, and along the top here are different plant species. The arrows between the two represent an observed interaction between the two species. So this is when a pollinator visits a flower. In this particular case, imagine that this yellow flower is only visited by this one species here. So it actually pretty specialized in the pollinator species that it provides floral resources to. But this pink flower is visited by all the pollinator species. So it's actually pretty generalized in the amount of species that the flower provides as resources to. So for the purpose of pollinator restoration, we might actually be more interested in using the pink flower that provides floral resources to a majority of the bee community. And so there's a number of different ways that we can decide what makes a flower important for pollinator restoration. One of them being pollinator abundance. So in this case, we don't really necessarily care about which species are visiting a flower. We just want to make sure that the flower is visited by the most pollinator individuals. So it receives high amounts of visitation from all pollinators. This might potentially be a sign that the flower is important to provide floral resources to a lot of bee individuals. Another thing that we could analyze a flower for is pollinator richness. This is the number of individual bee species that visit a flower. And so it might be an important indicator of the proportion of the community that relies on this flower for floral resources. Additionally, we might be interested in species of conservation concern or endangered species that visit a flower. So you can imagine if we're interested in maintaining habitat for the Western bumblebee, then we might want to revegetate some of these ecosystems with plants that are the preferred foraging resource for this bee species. And so throughout all of our work in this system, we were sort of able to select 9 different flower species, and some of these you guys might be familiar with, that are ideal for pollinators on wildlands in West Central Montana. So importantly, what I like to point out is that this consists of 3 plants that bloom in the beginning of the season, 3 plants that bloom in the middle of the season, and 3 plant species that bloom at the end of the season. And so that provides a consistent floral resource for pollinator communities of attractive plants for pollinators that provide floral resources to pollinators. So this includes plants like Bebb's willow, Oregon grape, kinnicknickberry, woods rose, silky lupin, snowberry, blanket flower, smooth aster, and showy fleabane. It's also important to note that we're able to produce all of these plants in high abundance to be able to provide land managers restoration materials at scale required on public lands. And so while we've accomplished a lot of work and on pollinator restoration, conservation on public lands, there's still plenty of work to be done into the future. So these are just a couple of ideas that come to my mind, but I'm sure that you guys can come up with some of your own ideas for what might be facing pollinators into the future. But I think about ideas like climate change, which are thought to affect most all ecosystem processes into the future. Especially, I'm sure that we've all experienced the effects of increasing frequency, severity, and size of wildfires. You know, we can see it in our fire seasons every year now. What sort of effect is that going to have on the demand for some of these seed materials, but also pollinator populations directly? Something that I'm really interested in investigating more is what are the effects of expanded recreation opportunities on pollinators? So in some of these wildlands that are mostly untouched by humans, as we get further and further into the backcountry, what disturbance might we cause that affects these pollinators? And I think this provides a lot of opportunities for public, private, and academic partnerships to be able to investigate these questions in order to conserve pollinators into the future. So with that, I would be more than willing to take questions on these topics about specifically related or maybe even unspecifically related to pollinator conservation.
So it looks like we did have a question from Christy. Are you looking at pollinators other than bees, like butterflies and flies?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So something that I didn't really mention is that there's a number of different species of insects and non-insects which also can serve as pollinators. So moths, beetles, bats, butterflies, flies can all serve as pollinators, and it's particularly important to have information on those species as well. For the purpose of my work here, no, it's just bees, but I think that that's a really good opportunity into the future that we sort of need to focus on more, is these forgotten pollinators, like flies in particular, which we don't really have a lot of information on. So that's a really, really good point, that there are other pollinator species that we need to do more work on.
Thanks. And then Tracy made a comment, decisions to do widespread chemical spraying, like what they'll be doing in the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming. I don't know, Tracy, if you want to expand on that, or Will, if you have anything to address in regards to chemical spraying projects.
Yeah, I'm unfamiliar with that project specifically of what they're going to be doing, but I think that the interesting aspect about spraying chemicals is that there is such a way that I think there's some best practice management to be able to avoid direct contact between chemicals and pollinators. So for instance, spraying at night when pollinators are not necessarily active. So to reduce direct exposure to pollinators. But there's also evidence to suggest that pollinators can then come into contact if those pesticides were to linger on foliage, for example. So yeah, pesticides is an interesting topic that I think has largely been shown to be detrimental to pollinators. And so I think it's going to be one of those issues that we might need to look more into how we can accomplish multiple goals into the future.
Greg and Wendy have asked, do you need to be concerned about ensuring the bee colonies have appropriate places to build hives and nests?
Yeah, so this is another really good question that I didn't elaborate a lot on. So there's multiple types of nesting strategies for pollinators. So we have cavity nesting bees, and these are bees that require holes in wood and rock and nest above ground in structures like holes in logs. There's also ground nesting bees. And so these are bees mostly like bumblebees, for example. They will sort of co-opt old abandoned burrows like of mice or something, or they'll actually dig into the ground in some soft substrate in order to be able to build their nest underground. And then mostly what people are familiar with is honeybee colonies. And so honeybee colonies are man-made boxes with frames that can be inserted into the box. And the benefit about these are that they can actually be moved pretty easily in order to supply pollination services around the country. So for example, in the Central Valley of California, when almond pollination or almond bloom is happening, we can actually move a lot of honeybees down into that area in order to supply these areas with the pollination services that they require. So to answer your question more directly, if we need to provide some of these cavity nesting bees with nesting substrates, there's actually bee hotels is what they're known as, which come with these straws that can be inserted into the hotel to provide nesting resources for those cavity nesting bees.
Doesn't look like we have any other questions in the chat right now, but again, feel free, if anybody, to unmute yourself and ask a question, or go ahead and type it into the chat. We have, still have about 15 minutes before we have to say goodbye to Will. So yeah, feel free to jump in. Okay, Will asked, in places like the breaks, which have a high degree of heterogeneity between natural and managed ag lands, what have you seen as far as effects on abundance or richness in one area or the other as a result of that proximity? I.e., does increasing habitat in natural areas improve it in the managed areas?
Yes, that's a super good question, and I like to think about those sorts of questions a lot. I think that there is a known benefit for these public lands for agricultural systems. So these public lands and wildlands serve as a hotspot of bee diversity, which can then, quote, spill over into these agriculture fields and then provide an ecosystem service for pollination in these agricultural systems. So having your farms closer to these wild lands actually benefits the production of fruits and nuts on these farms. On the flip side, though, these farms can actually serve as huge resource pulses for pollinators. So sometimes when crops are blooming, they bloom in really high abundance, and that provides a lot of floral resources for pollinators. But that really only happens at a very specific time of year. So the idea is that we want to have resources that are complementary, or resources that bloom at different points in the year, to be able to provide pollinators consistent floral resources for the entire growing season. So in short, agriculture can be important. Public lands are also important. And I think having a mixture of the two can actually support a lot of pollinators, but we need to think about conserving these areas of high pollinator diversity.
Thank you. And thank you for your questions, everybody. So I do have a question. You said your current seed mix is 9 species. Have you seen a difference in increased variety of species versus decreased, a more smaller variety with less success or anything like that? I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but I've heard that, a higher diversity, really like intense number of species within a mix tends to be better in many situations, but 9 seems low. So I'm just surprised to hear that number.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So as a part of that study, we aimed to select the 3 best plants from the early, middle, and late season groups of species, in order to provide land managers with kind of like the optimal mix. But it's also important to realize that if we include more species in these plant mixes, we will always be able to support more pollinator species. So it's kind of like a cost benefit analysis, where if we want to provide land managers with kind of like the simple recipe for how we're going to attract the most pollinator species or the most pollinator individuals, then you might want to only select a couple of these plant species that perform really well. But maybe if you have more resources to be able to include more seeds in your seed mixes, then maybe you would think about expanding the number of plants to include in there. So it's kind of like a triage cost benefit analysis in this case.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Very project dependent then.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And Will, other Will has asked, where can you get these types of seed mixes?
So the ones that I actually evaluated are through the Forest Service Native Plant Program. And so they have federal nurseries, which I think are mostly just available to to other Forest Service land managers, but I believe that the different conservation districts located around the state of Montana have a pollinator seed distribution program that you can contact your local conservation district to be able to see what they have available.
Yeah, that is an excellent resource that I think definitely underutilized. Your conservation districts have, at least if not part of the pollinator program themselves, that have those connections to get you connected with seed mixes. So definitely contact your local CD. But Mary asked, do you set up seed programs for land bank lands?
So I think this sort of might relate to the last question, where your local conservation district will be able to provide you with seeds that are designed for pollinators. Me personally, I don't, but I think your local conservation district would be able to.
Yeah, that's again a great connection. Tracy has asked, how about working with some of the various native plant growers? I'm guessing that has to do with just the cost and scale.
Definitely, yep. So there is that to consider, is the scale at which we need to be able to source some of these seeds. It's, you know, metric tons worth of seed. And then on top of that, to be able to provide them at areas that are huge, tens of thousands of acres, year after year, is an incredible demand.
And then, yeah, so if you are looking on a more personal, your own private land, setting up pollinator stuff, Christy has mentioned the Montana Native Plant Society used to have a directory of native plant growers in Montana. Check out their webpage. Some local chapters have plant sales too. So definitely, if you are looking to, you know, set up your own stuff on your land or get your neighbors involved or something like that, they're also an excellent resource. And then
yes. Oh, and to add on to that, so that's a super very good resource. Thanks for passing that along. Pollinator gardens do provide resources for wild pollinators, and they can kind of act as a little refuge for pollinators. So it's important that everybody gets involved with that. One thing that I will note is we encourage people to be called messy gardeners, and that's to provide nesting resources for pollinators too. So flowers are just one aspect of this, but also to be able to provide things like coarse woody debris or leaves that bees can burrow in to form their nests is part of being a messy gardener. So yeah, providing nesting resources for bees is also the other aspect of this equation to be able to support wild bee communities.
awesome. Yeah, I think that's a really cool project for anybody who has the time and the space for it. Like Will said, really beneficial. Kelly said, how do these species perform in the presence of invasive species?
So invasive species, and I'm going to assume that you're referring to invasive plant species, actually sometimes can be an important resource for pollinators, because invasive plant species have really high abundance of flowers. They bloom really, really intensely. So they can actually provide a lot of resources for pollinators. And sometimes invasive species bloom at odd times during the year and provide resources for pollinators during times when pollinators might not have resources. So the example that I like to use is spotted knapweed throughout the state. Spotted knapweed has a bloom period which is in the middle to end of August. And so when a lot of these plant species are declining, or they're not necessarily, they've already produced seed and they're sort of done for the year and dried up for the year, spotted knapweed actually still provides resources for pollinators. And so it can sort of prolong the growing season. The flip side of that is spotted knapweed grows everywhere and it outcompetes a lot of the native plant species. So that might be the only resource that's available for pollinators at that time. And that would sort of be like eating one thing for your entire life. I don't think any of us want to have that simple of a diet. So there are trade-offs. Invasive species also degrade ecosystem health in many other ways. So I'm not necessarily advocating that we keep invasive flowers around, but I think it's a pretty complex conversation when it comes to the relationship between plants and invasive, or the relationship between pollinators and invasive species.
And did you look at, I'm sorry if you covered this, did you look at how the seed or the species that you have in your seed mix compete with some of those invasive species? Did you choose them for tolerance of that at all?
No, so we didn't. And the way that we chose these species are plants that are available to the Forest Service that they've already been able to produce at these huge quantities. So we were sort of limited in our scope there. But the next steps for this project would be to actually plant these species and see how they perform in somewhat of like an experimental setting to know if we actually got it right. And then if we didn't, if there are other plants that might perform better, then kind of go back to the drawing board, test it, and then see if we can improve on it.
Gotcha. Well, do we have any other questions? We still have a couple minutes. So if you're saving a question, speak up.
Yeah, these are great questions.
Yeah. Well, seeing none, oh, do we have somebody? Oh, we got a thank you. Yeah, thank you
Yeah, of course.
much. And thank you guys again all for your questions too and showing up. Well, with that, I think we can probably wrap things up. Again, a huge thank you to Will for coming out and spending the evening with us to talk about this really critical topic. I think we've all kind of now thought of things that we want to go do our individual research on and kind of see how we can get more involved. So that's really great, and that's really what we look for in these things. So thank you again. Thank you guys for coming out. We wouldn't put these on if you guys didn't show up. So it's really nice to see your faces, to see you guys all coming out. Really appreciate it. And if you guys are interested in seeing any of our other former or past Tune In Tuesday events, they are all posted on our YouTube channel. If you just type in Friends of the Missouri Breaks Monument into the search bar, you can find our channel and all of our past Tune In Tuesdays. This is also being recorded and will be posted on there. So if you want to revisit some of this information, go ahead and visit that. Be sure to join us for our next Tune In Tuesday. That's going to be happening on November 30th. We are really excited to be joined by Thomas Alpel, the author of 5 Months on the Missouri. And he's going to kind of take us along on the adventure of a lifetime. He spent 5 months going from Montana to St. Louis in a dugout canoe with one of Clark's descendants. So a pretty exciting tale, and I'm really excited to hear more about it. So it's one I don't think any of us want to miss. Again, that's going to be November 30th, again, Tuesday at 6 p.m. And then just a final thank you to everybody. If you're interested in learning more about our organization, please visit our website at MissouriBreaks.org. You can find out ways to get involved with us, volunteer. You can see more about our virtual events. Find us on social media. That's where we advertise a lot of these events that come up. So that's a really good way to stay up to date. Sign up for our email. Again, another really great way to stay up to date with what's going on. And then, of course, we always appreciate your support and donations. So if you want to make a donation, you can also find that on our website, again, MissouriBreaks.org. But with that, another thank you to Will and to all of you, and I can say good night.
Thank you guys. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Will. Appreciate
Yeah.
it.
Of course.